Meg Oakley. I'm the Director of Copyright and Scholarly Communication here at the Georgetown Library and Chair of the Scholarly Communication Committee. And on behalf of the library and the committee, I'd like to welcome you here to our program today on scholarly publishing. We're very glad you could all come, and we have great panelists here who will give you all kinds of insight and tips on how to get your manuscripts published. Before we start, I have just a couple of announcements. First of all, outside we have a couple of brochures and pamphlets for you to pick up. For your faculty, we have our Library Faculty Services brochure. And we're also very happy to announce a new website we have with information on the entire scholarly publishing process, from research to marketing your publication. And the URL for that website is on the bottom of that page, and we hope you will all take a look at it and feel free to share any comments that you have with me. My email address is on the bottom of the page. Have a couple of thank yous before we get started. I'm going to thank Grace McKinney, who actually is not here at the moment, our events coordinator for putting this event together on the organizational side, and David Hagan from our Gillardin New Media Center, who is recording this event. It will be up on YouTube next week. And last but not least, to Carol Sargent, who has brought these editors here today and put this program together for all of you. And with that, I will turn it over to Carol.
Thank you. And I'm so happy to see you all. One of the wonderful things about the job that I do at Georgetown, guiding faculty to scholarly publishing, is I'm not really on the hook, because I say, don't ask me what I think. I'm going to tell you what I think. But that doesn't mean you actually have to write it down. Ask an editor what an editor thinks. And I really think that the whole point of my office is to facilitate conversations between authors and editors, and to help you stop worrying about what your colleagues think or what everyone is kind of saying around you, and engage with actual scholarly publishing on its own terms. And so we get to do that today. And Richard Brown, the director of Georgetown University Press, is going to introduce the two University Press editors that we have today. But we also have a special guest, and I added him in a bit later on this event. But later in May, we're going to focus more on his career, and that's Peter Ginna, because he not only was at Oxford for a long time, and I'm going to do a more formal introduction just a little bit later when we start the talk, but he also founded one of the imprints at Bloomsbury, which, as you know, has had a very interesting relationship also with our Doha campus. He's had an amazing career, and so what we want to give you is a nice up close and personal from two acquiring editors at two presses right now in the university press world, and then a little more of the deep catalog knowledge going back that we'll get from both Peter and Richard. And so we're going to add that all together to make, I think, a pretty dynamic and immediate conversation. So Richard Brown, director of Georgetown University Press, I welcome you to the podium.
Thanks. Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Carol. I really enjoy being involved in these programs. If you all don't know Carol, if you're here for the first time, let me urge you to get to know her. We are really fortunate at Georgetown to have a resource like Carol. I know of no other university that has someone with her expertise, someone with her experience or contacts in the publishing field, who is helping authors, scholars find their voice and find publishers. And if you don't know Carol, talk to her today. You'll learn something about publishing, and it will help your career. It's my happy task to introduce our two University Press editor speakers today, Sara Cohen and Elizabeth Ault. Sara and Elizabeth are editors at two university presses that I really admire, Temple and Duke. Those presses have slightly different editorial profiles, some overlap, but they've managed to distinguish themselves in their disciplines, and they really represent the best of what university press publishing is all about. They also illustrate a sermon that Carol preaches, and that is, it's all about the fit. And that's just one point I want to make in this introduction. Outside of Oxford and Peter can speak to Oxford. Outside of Oxford and Cambridge, which cover an enormous range of subject areas, most university presses really do zero in on a handful, dozen, 15, maybe 20 subject areas. And that's really where we try to focus our efforts. There are editorial reasons for that. There are marketing reasons for that. Publishing committees at these other presses outside of Oxford and Cambridge really do spend a lot of time thinking about the fit. How's that going to work with our editorial profile? How's it going to work with the marketing department? We don't want to publish, as a rule, orphans. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're approaching publishers. How does your project really fit with the university press you're talking to? But anyway, you're here to hear from Sara and Elizabeth, so let me introduce them. Sara Cohen, to my immediate left after Peter, is an editor at Temple University Press, where she acquires titles in Asian American Studies, Sexuality Studies, Music, Literary Studies, some other areas. In 2011, she earned a PhD in English from Minnesota, moved immediately to UNC Press. She was an editorial assistant there for a couple of years, and then in 2013 went to Temple. The first book she acquired at Temple, and editors remember their first books, don't they? Peter?
Yeah.
Yes. was a memorable book, and it was titled Chilean New Song, The Political Power of Music, 1960s to 73. The author was J. Patrice McSherry. This book received the Association of Third World Studies, received an award from the Association of Third World Studies. It was the 2015 Cecil B. Curry Award for the book that best examines the developing world. That's quite a lead-off. Yeah. Sara, I'm afraid you set the bar too high, though, and so everything else has to be very outstanding, but I'm sure you can do that. Sure. Sara's also a member of the Association of American University Press's Copyright and Intellectual Property Committee, is co-founder of Temple's new Digital, Scholarly, and Publishing Working Group, and it's good to have you here.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Ault. Good to have you here as well.
Good to be here. Thank you.
She's an assistant editor at Duke University Press, where she has worked very closely with Ken Wissaker. If you don't know the name Ken Wissaker, you should. He's a bit of a legend in university press publishing. He's the editorial director at Duke and has built a formidable list in cultural studies, gender and identity, and other related areas. And Ken is a real powerhouse. And Elizabeth has been in the middle of that for the last several years. Since 2012. She began acquiring titles herself a year ago, and she's got lots of projects in the pipeline, and I'm sure those two will make contributions, just as Ken's had. So Sara will speak first, and then Elizabeth will follow. Or Elizabeth will speak first. Either way, did you all have that arranged?
I thought Elizabeth was going first.
Elizabeth, why don't you lead off?
I will go first.
Right,
Okay.
and then
Go
Sara will
in
follow.
Okay.
And then we'll come back to,
Yeah,
we'll
then
come
we'll
back to
come back to
Carol.
me. I'll give you an introduction, a more deeper introduction of Peter, and then we'll go to the talk.
Great, so thank you all, welcome, glad you're here. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. May I close this computer? Is this doing something? Yeah, there it went. Hello, good morning. I have such a beautiful view both of this amazing audience. Thank you so much for showing up. I understand the last day of classes was yesterday, so perhaps you're feeling a bit of respite, a bit of a moment to breathe right now. Thank you for bringing that to this room, and I also have this beautiful view of beyond, so that's wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction, Richard. Thank you so much, Carol and Meg, for organizing the event. It's really lovely to be here and to take a moment myself to reflect on what I do every day. As Richard mentioned, I am an American Studies PhD from the University of Minnesota, so my career has always been as an interdisciplinary scholar. And that's what's been really exciting for me about working on Ken's list at Duke, and about working at Duke in general, is that Duke is a very interdisciplinary publisher. So what I always think about when I think about our list, we do have fields in which we specialize, but we're always so much more interested in the questions that a book is asking. So, you know, I'll be at a meeting, I go to the Society for Cinema and Media Studies meeting, and someone will come by the booth and say, you know, would Duke publish a book? Would you be interested in a book on Korean cinema? And my thought about that is always, well, it depends on what the book is really about. Because the book is probably not really about Korean cinema. Ideally at Duke, the book will use Korean cinema as a way into a broader question. It'll take what I think I might be able to guess
a book on Korean cinema might argue, and it'll twist that. It'll take it in an unpredictable direction that I couldn't have guessed, just based on my knowledge of Korea, of Korean history, of Korean cinema. It'll use that subject to open up a broader argument and a broader question. So that's always what I think about being the signature of the Duke book, is the book that really tries to do something in a field, to ask the field, what would our work look like if we put this at the center? And then not just to ask that question, but to demonstrate what that would look like. To take that turn and to make that twist. I think because of our interest in books that are doing something, that are asking these questions, that are about really sticky material things, but that also are about these more abstract things, we do have a reputation as a theory press. I like to think that the theory that we do isn't just theory for its own sake, but is theory that really, again, has stakes. And so the stakes are really important. It's not just theory for its own sake, but it is about asking these bigger questions and really trying to make a mark on the field, to force your peers and colleagues to think with you in a different way. And so that's been really exciting for me to watch Ken model that acquisitions philosophy, to work both with first-time authors and with very established authors to work on books that are going to make them kind of a difference. I think sometimes I get a few questions too about, do you still do first books? I think there's some anxiety about getting a first book published. Well, there's always anxiety about getting any book published. But I think one thing I've learned in my few years in the publishing industry is that kind of no one, maybe except for Carol, really knows how it works. And I think that's because every press is very different. Every press has a slightly different, as Richard mentioned, both a set of a focus and a set of practices. But Duke is very interested in still publishing first books and very interested in working with first-time authors, particularly because often a first book has more maybe of an outsider's perspective on a field, maybe is more at that bleeding edge of theory of where the next turn in the field is going to come from. First-time books have some advantages in the sense that you have done a lot of research, right? It's like the first album. You've spent your entire life waiting to write this book. So you have the raw material. Sometimes that can be a disadvantage because you just spent the last 7 to 10 to 15 years of your life working on your dissertation, and you have a certain set of investments in what the argument's going to be and what the materials are going to be. And you really have to learn, when you write a first book, to disconnect from that. To really figure out, you went out, you wrote a dissertation, you brought back a good report from the field, and now you have to take that into something where you guide your readers through. You're now the master, you're now the expert. You're not bringing this back to a committee of people that have agreed in advance to read your dissertation as a part of their job. Your job is to make someone actually want to read your book. So the dissertation, you're showing your work. You're doing your lit review, even if you don't think that's what you're doing, that's probably what you did. You're kind of showing how you got to your major intervention. In the book, you actually don't want to bury the lead like that. You don't need to show your work. You need to put the intervention in the beginning. And that's sort of the most important advice that we give to first-time book writers is really it's important to claim your voice. And I think that the voice, which Richard mentioned as well, is so important. The second book has its own set of challenges in that you maybe feel like you put everything into that first book. What is the project? How do you build on the voice that you've established for yourself? I think about that. Sometimes the challenge is you have all this research that you've done for a new project. One of the metaphors that we like to use is that the author is like the director of a film. So you've gone out and shot the footage, right? But the footage is not the movie, in the same way that the research, the archive, is not the book. So your job then, once you have your footage, is to shape that, to build the arc, to pick the arc, because in any project, there are any number of paths the argument could take. Any number of stories you could tell with the research that you've done. But your job is to pick one and stick to it. And I think about then, in practice, moving on a little bit from the philosophy of what we do to how we put that into practice. One of the things I've really loved getting to see on the editorial side is the peer review process, which can often strike a note of fear in the heart. I think of it as a really exciting and important opportunity to get meaningful feedback on your work. I think that a good press, a press like Georgetown or Temple or Duke, will find readers who are sympathetic to your project and want it to succeed. So I think sometimes peer review gets sort of put down as a gatekeeping process, maybe where people are kept out. I think of it more as if you're finding the right readers, there are people who will want to extend that invitation in. So there are people who will be on board with the method of the project, with the idea of the project. And the goal, right, is to get them to give you the feedback to make the project the best it can be. They want it to be the best version of itself. And being on the sort of reading and receiving side of that process is so amazing because the senior scholars in the room know y'all are so generous with your junior peers, and it's really something that's incredible to see. The way that people want to lift up this new work and to build an intellectual community that is exploring these questions. We have a little bit of like the sort of the film process metaphor comes into play in the reader reports too, where that review process for us we think of as sort of a test screening. So you know, if you're showing the film and you thought like, oh, this is the big dramatic scene where everyone's going to meet the Kleenex, and instead they're laughing. You know, as the director, you can't say, oh, they didn't get it. They didn't understand. You know, you have to go back and recut. So now you don't have to do exactly what the test audience might say you need to do, so you don't have to do exactly what the readers might say. They might say, the lit review in chapter 3 is too long, cut it. That might not be what you need to do. It might be that you need, in that specific chapter, to explain some of the theoretical background. But you need to give readers just as much as they need to come with you. And I think, again, that's some of the transition in the first book, from showing your work, to really just paring down your citations to what your readers need to follow you. So sometimes that's the issue. Sometimes maybe it's that they needed that background in the introduction and they didn't get it there. So by the time they get to chapter 3, they don't understand why they're now reading this. So your job as the author is to figure out, what are they diagnosing? What is the discomfort that these readers are saying or seeing, really trying to get at? So again, you're in charge, right? You as the author, you are in charge of fixing the problem. So you don't have to do exactly what readers say, but you have to figure out how to fix it, how to make sure that everyone is crying when they should be. So that's, and again, just sort of watching people do that, I think I've worked on several books that really have been triumphs of the reader report process. And granted, probably when we sent the book out for a third round of peer review, the author did not think it was going to be a triumph of the review process. But you know, I've seen a few books go out 3 or 4 times where, you know, at the beginning the author thought that they were writing a very kind of traditional media studies, American studies, African American studies project. Okay, it wasn't that traditional, it was about porn. But it turned out that instead of doing a reading of these porn films that helped us to understand Black sexuality in the 1980s, what they were really doing was making a major intervention into feminist visual cultural studies. And that is something that the readers really brought out because they were saying, you know, in chapter 4, you're saying this thing, that's the thing. And so watching readers help authors identify both the problems, but also the real moments of excitement that they might be too deep in the project to see. That's another really exciting thing as an editor to get to watch and to get to assist in, right? I think the secret that a lot of acquisitions editors will say is that we don't actually get to spend as much time doing the developmental editing, the conceptual editing, really kind of getting in there, getting our hands on the text as much as we would like. I think for a lot of us, we say that's like our guilty pleasure. Because that is really exciting, that is the really energizing part of the job, to talk with authors about their ideas and to read how they're expressing them. A lot of our time is taken up with sending hectoring emails to readers whose reports might be 2 months late, or sitting on committees that are very exciting, that are sort of in a different way, and I really am eager to hear more about Sara's work with the Digital Publishing Committee. I think that's certainly a conversation that we could have as well, as sort of about digital publishing, if that's something people are interested in talking about. So yeah, that's part of what I do, and most exciting is that, but unfortunately, it's not as much of my job as I wish that it would be. It's been very exciting for me at Duke to take on our African Studies list. Again, my field is American Studies. I thought of myself as this wide-ranging interdisciplinary scholar. I had committee members from 4 different departments, and I was not a historian, but I worked with historians, only to go to the African Studies conference and find out that actually the University of Minnesota has one of the most well-respected African history PhD programs in the country, which I did not know about. So it's been really exciting though, and I think that most editors would say it's a process of constant learning and constant discovery and really getting to stay on top of the literature and really kind of learn who's connected to who and how those connections work. And that's been really exciting for me to learn in African Studies, and I look forward to learning other new fields as I continue on. And I think one of the most exciting things that I think Duke can do in that field that we do in the fields that we're in is again focus on lifting up work that has the potential to reach across fields, on lifting up these bigger questions that may surface out of primary sources in African Studies, but that raise questions that can speak to people that study South Asia, that study indigenous cultures in North America, that study infrastructures of media production in Los Angeles. And I think that, again, focusing on work that raises those bigger questions is really exciting for me. That's about all I think I want to say right now. I think that's my time. I don't want to go too long because I do think we can have a really interesting conversation with your questions about both the sort of current state of publishing, maybe some questions you've been dealing with as you work on your own projects, and maybe the future too. So thank you so much.
I guess I want to start by thanking Richard for his introduction. I want to thank Carol for the invitation, and I want to thank Elizabeth for that awesome and inspiring talk, which I'm going to make all of my authors watch. I'm not going to talk as much about the process. In one of the emails that Carol sent, she said, "We want you to teach us you." And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about Temple as a press and our identity as a press, and also how I work as an editor. And I only printed half of my notes today, so I'm going to be reading small print off of my iPad. So I hope you'll bear with me. Temple University Press was founded in 1969. I'm going to give you some stats so you can envision what we do. We have over 1,400 books in print. We were an early publisher of books in urban studies, housing and labor studies, organizational reform, social service reform, public religion, healthcare, and cultural studies. We're one of the first university presses to publish on public religion. I'm not totally sure what that is. We're one of the earliest presses to publish on women's studies, ethnic studies, including Asian American studies, Latino studies, African American studies. And we have strong lists in political science, criminology, gender, and sexuality studies, as well as sports and society. So as a press, we think of ourselves as publishing 3 types of books within those fields, and you guys are probably all familiar with these terms from conversations you've had with Carol or your colleagues. We do monographs, which are the kinds of books that we envision are only going to be read by serious scholars and by libraries, purchased by libraries. We do course adoption books, which are books that we imagine will have some use in classrooms, and we also do trade books. I work on all 3 of those types of books, and so I thought I'd give you an example of each so that you can kind of envision what those things are. So I have a book coming out on our spring list that's about Eritrean teachers and the way that they were complicit or the way that they resisted the nation's compulsory military service for students in their last year of high school. It's a beautiful book. It's on a great topic. We don't anticipate there are a ton of people who want to read this, right? And so that's a monograph. A course adoption book that I'm working right now on an edited collection of autoethnographies written by students with disabilities. And this is a book that we envision might have some use in a classroom. It also has a lot of framing, introductory sections that lay out terminology, that review useful scholarship. That's the kind of thing we envision being used in classrooms. We also have less obvious things that we think of as course adoption books. I have a book coming out on our next list that's about, it's an ethnography of people in the upper Midwest with ghost stories. And it's written by a sociologist. He is the president of the Society for Symbolic Interactions right now, and so it's about symbolic interaction, and it's a sociology book, and it's also ethnographic, and so it can really be used in a couple different kinds of classrooms. It's really readable too, which is one of the things we look for with course adoption books. We want to make sure that students are actually going to be able to get through them. Although, as someone who taught, I know that students don't actually do their reading. You do. A trade book that I recently worked on, I just wrapped up, thank goodness, the memoir of a Philadelphia jazz musician named Benny Golson. Does anybody know who Benny Golson is? So, oh, you do?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm glad Leonard doesn't. So Benny Golson is a jazz legend. He is from Philadelphia, which is one of the reasons I worked on this book with him. He was in Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. He was in Art Farmer's Jazz Tet. And he grew up in North Philly with Bill Cosby and, more importantly, John Coltrane. He and John Coltrane were best friends. They learned to play their saxophones together. And so it's a story that is very rich in local history. It's very rich in African American history. And then it's also this great document about the history of jazz. And Benny went on to write music for television and film, and so he has a really kind of interesting and weird trajectory. And over the course of working on that book, he and I became really good friends, and he asks that my son think of him as his uncle. So it's a very different kind of book than Eritrean teachers or than autoethnographies written by students with disabilities. So a little bit more about Temple. We are a small press. We're smaller than Duke is. I think we're probably bigger than Georgetown, or about the same size. Right now we have 12 people on staff. We have 3 acquisitions editors. I'm the only woman acquisition editor, which is something that I'm really proud of. And because of our size, we all have to get along really well. And also because of our size, we're able to improvise a lot. I think if you have a bigger press, there's more bureaucracy, and as people affiliated with the university, you know all about bureaucracy and how that can slow things down. At a small press, we're able to be very nimble, we're able to be creative, and we can do things very quickly. So it's a great environment to work as an employee, and it's also a cool place to be as an author, I think. Our current director came to us from the electronic journals world. She worked on Project Muse and on JSTOR, which you all are probably familiar with from your research. And because of her kind of non-traditional publishing background, we're starting to think about some different ways that we can expand our business and different kinds of things that we can be doing other than the traditional book. And as Richard mentioned in his intro of me, I just started a digital publishing and scholarship working group. I co-founded that with a postdoc at our library who was brought in to help them get their digital scholarship center started up. And so it's been a kind of interesting experience. We've only had 2 meetings, but for me, I mean, as a book publisher, it's very hard for me to think about what publishing looks like that doesn't come between 2 covers. And so the great thing about this group has been that there's people from the library, we have a couple of graduate students, we're starting to think about what happens after the monograph, what is different, what can we do that's different from the monograph, and how can we do digital work that doesn't just replicate the kind of work that we do in books, but put it online instead of in a book. So there are a lot of really cool questions there that we're working on. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think of myself as an editor. I thought that would be helpful. I mean, I know you all know a lot about what editors do, so I'm not going to tell you exactly what we do, but I thought it would be helpful to you if I talked a little bit about how I think of my work, and I thought that might help to demonstrate to you what kind of person I am and what kind of editor I am. So I recently, one of the things I constantly have to do as an acquisitions editor is explain to non-academics what my job is. And it's somewhat hard to do, and one of the explanations I've been using recently is that I'm basically a talent scout. I go out to conferences, I meet people, I Google people, I read journals, I meet people that other people tell me to meet with, and so I'm really just trying to build a big network of really smart, really cool people doing great work. And so somebody said to me, oh, it's like you do A&R for a record label. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I do. So that's one way that I talk about it. One of the ways that I describe my role to authors is that I compare it to midwifery. And because what I'm doing is I'm trying to get, healthy mom, healthy baby, right? Like healthy book, healthy author. And every case is different, right? Different people need more support than others. Some people need a lot of emotional support, and some people don't want any support. And some people need support in the form of close edits, and some people need support in the form of, more broad edits. And so I really try to help my authors in the ways that they need to be, and in the way be helped, and in the ways that my time allows me to help them. And then, of course, I work with them as they're carrying this book. We go up through labor and delivery together, and then the book comes out, and I hand it over to the production department, and I don't have to deal with it anymore. Once you're my author, you're always my author. All my authors have a special place in my heart. But we have to keep moving, and I do 25 books a year, so I don't have quite as much time to spend with everybody as I would like to. One of the kinds of authors that I want to work with, I thought would be helpful for you, and that's a question I've been asked a lot lately, is what kind of people would you like to work with? I want to work with people who are smart, obviously, but one of the other things that's important to me is I want to work with people who are nice. And so it's hard to find people who are both smart and nice sometimes, and right? It's a very basic thing. But anyway, yeah, I want to work with people who are smart and nice, and I want to work with people who are open to criticism. And I think Elizabeth talked a little bit about how important it is to be open to criticism from your readers. You would be surprised how many scholars we deal with who are not receptive to criticism, who come back to us and say, these readers don't know what they're talking about, I wrote the perfect book. So it's really important to me that authors be open to that. And I find that working with first-time authors, actually they're the people who are the most open to criticism, because they're relatively fresh out of the dissertation process, which is all about being criticized. They're dealing with job market stuff often, or they've just dealt with the job market, which is also about being criticized. And so these are the people who I find I have the most productive relationships with right now. So like Duke, we're also very interested in first books, in part because people doing their first books are often at the cutting edge, and for me in part because those are the people who are most excited about the work that they're doing and most receptive to talking about the work and working with you on that. Also, I'm going to talk briefly about my trajectory. Like Elizabeth, I have a PhD from University of Minnesota, and I actually know Elizabeth from my past life. And I'm really fortunate to have her as a colleague again in this life as an acquisitions editor. There aren't a lot of us, I don't think. I don't meet a lot of people with PhDs who are acquisitions editors, actually. Do you?
In our department at Duke, I have a PhD, and then two of the editors. So Courtney and Gisela both have PhDs, but then the other three editors and assistant editors don't. So we have a mixed department. I worry about it because I don't think you need a PhD to be an acquisitions editor. I don't think that's the necessary credential
No,
at
it's
all.
not at all. And I had a job interview with a press that said to me, we don't like to hire people with PhDs. And I said, well, why? Because people with PhDs only care about one thing. They're focused on their research area, and that's the one thing that they're interested in, and that's the one thing that they want to publish on. And they're not receptive to new ideas and things outside of that area. So that really hurt my feelings, right? Because I'm interested in everything. But it was kind of an interesting conversation to have. Yeah. So anyway, if anybody has any questions for me about what it's like to make that move from having a PhD to being an editor, I don't know if anybody has considered that as a possibility, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. I'm sure Elizabeth would too. And I like to think that I'm not fixated on the one thing that I worked on. I have a PhD in literature, and we do very few books in literature and literary studies. But I think that what I do bring to the table as a person with a PhD is that I'm trained as a writer, I'm trained as a researcher, I'm trained as an editor, I'm trained as a thinker, and those are all things that I can bring to any manuscript that comes to me. We're not scholars in the fields that we acquire in, and most editors aren't, and I think that's one of the most important things to remember as you're submitting your proposals to people, to make sure that you're explaining your terms, to not assume that they know everything about your field, and to really, just sort of the thing that we know, the thing that we're experts on is the publishing process. We're not experts on your field. And so I think it's really important to trust your editor when they tell you things that are going to help with the process. That's pretty much all that I wanted to say, and I'm sure that we'll have a Q&A that takes us in all kinds of cool directions. I'm really looking forward to it, and looking forward to hearing what Peter has to say. So thank you so much for having me.
All right, that's fun. And yes, my instructions to the editors were, please tell us about you, because I say, even though there are general principles that we can discuss when approaching presses, such as I do remind people that you're rarely speaking to a peer, and so your perspective shouldn't be only accessible and understandable by peers, and that's a good thing. That's actually going to help your book get out in the world and be more successful. It's not a problem. But there's also that there's just such an incredibly wide range, and by seeing how different their two presses are and how differently they think about stuff, I think you'll get a feel for, if you want the best way, I think, to understand the university press world, is go to the book aisle of a major conference, and it does not have to be a conference in your field. In fact, you can keep your eyes open for just major conferences that come to Washington, D.C. in academic fields, and you can get an aisle pass for about $10. The most I've ever been charged was $25, so you don't even have to register for the whole conference, and you can just meet people. It's a little easier if you send out your information to editors ahead of time and you actually have some welcomes at the booth. But I want you to feel like you can always just walk to a booth. Sometimes you will not be meeting editors, sometimes you will be meeting PR people or people who work in another part of the press, but anybody can help you who works at a press to get your mind around the culture of a press. And when you look around at the booths, you're looking at their babies, you're looking at things that are so important to them. And so really come prepared to engage with the work you see and to ask questions about it rather than just saying, hey, I've got this book, will you look at it? Look at them back, and I think you're going to find that this is a world that you're well prepared to engage with because you already have all the tools. We wouldn't be sitting together in this room if you didn't. So you can feel very confident about it. Next, as we go to our Q&A, I'm going to include both Richard Brown, who some of you just met and many of you know well, and also Peter Ginna. And I want to give you a little introduction to Peter's career because in the spring semester, and he and I will discuss when would be good, we're going to have another event that will focus more on the academic to trade book. And the book that is supposed to go out to a wider audience. If you're pre-tenure, I'm not going to be pushing you toward that book. If you are post-tenure, we're going to start thinking about it in various ways. There are three main categories as I understand them, and our editors mentioned, which are the monograph. The academic to trade is one that still has its roots in the scholarship, but now goes out a little bit broader. But then there are purely trade books. Presses do books that are simply meant to get that wider audience and really bring the author into public intellectual life in a very headline-grabbing sort of way. And so Peter's background is in many types of books, but also that. Peter Ginna has been a book editor and publisher in New York since 1982. He's worked in several different kinds of publishing companies, from Literary Independence, which is his history in that is actually really cool, to Big Five commercial houses. Most recently, he was the publisher of Bloomsbury Press, an imprint he founded in 2006, devoted to serious nonfiction. Earlier, he was editorial director for trade books at Oxford University Press for 10 years, and he also held editorial positions at Crown Random House, St. Martin's Press, and Persia Books. And two titles he's edited have actually received the Pulitzer Prize, and others have earned the Bancroft Prize, the Linton Prize, the Owsley Award, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, among other awards. Another thing we're going to focus on when we focus in spring is how and why do books win prizes, and what does that mean in an academic world? We obviously don't write books just to win prizes, but is there a way that we can learn from the awarded pool something about our own public intellectual conversation? Some of the best-known authors he's worked with include James McPherson, David Hackett Fisher, Naomi Oreskes, Alice Kessler-Harris, John Lewis Gaddis, Michael B. Oren, and Daniel Ellsberg. He blogs about books and the publishing industry, so you can visit him at drsyntax.net. But here's a really fun one, and this is what I'll leave us on, that he's editing a book called What Editors Do, a collection of essays about book editors and their role in publishing. and it's going to be published by Chicago. So now a few ground rules for the Q&A. The first one is an absolute rule, and you please, please, please follow this. Tell us who you are. When you stand up, would you please do two things? Would you tell us who you are and what department or program you come from? Give us a word of context. And if you're working on a book, it would be nice to hear about that. You don't have to go into a long discussion. It can be brief, but I'd really like to have that for the record, and also so our editors can have a sense of that. Think about a question that you can ask succinctly and that we can sort of engage with. And as you ask questions or you get follow-ons, that's fine too. But let's kind of, before you ask a follow-on question, go ahead and stop with one. Let's see if there are other questions, and then we can take time for follow-ons. I'll let you know if we're up for follow-ons. So Richard, if you want to come up and join us, sure. We can start the Q&A, and I will moderate, so I'll just come around and sort of pick you and ask you to step on in. And questions? Yes.
Yes, good morning. I am Carmelo Santos, and I teach in the theology department, a course that I call God and the Brain. And I was curious about I know it varies, but the average time, the process you described is so long. So what is the average time from the beginning to the end?
That might actually be a good editor question, because
Indeed.
it probably varies so much.
Well, to start off with, once the book is in production, it's an 11-month production process. So that's after the peer review. So I think that is sometimes people get to that finish line and they're like, I'm sorry, what? So I would start by that. I mean, I don't think there is an average. I've worked on books that were put under contract in 1996. I've worked that. I have seen a book move through the peer review process in 6 months. It kind of just depends on what shape the manuscript is in when it comes to us, how the readers respond to it, how much work is required. Most things at Duke do go through at least 2 rounds of peer review. 3 is not atypical for us, just to make sure that the book is the strongest version of itself that it can be. So I would say on average, maybe 2 years. And that's in part because we're trying to build books that will outlast their moment. So they may come out of a particular theoretical moment or turn, but they're going to have to outlast that, right? The book is for posterity, so it's worth getting it right.
Our process is similar. Once the book goes into production, it's 10 months for us, so it's about the same timeline. Not to compete with you. And yeah, I mean, so much depends on the shape that the manuscript's in. So I've had manuscripts that come in that have only gone through 1 round of review and that, have been on the shelves like within a year of my getting the first manuscript. But a lot of what I've been doing lately, especially because I'm still doing some list building, is sending out partial manuscripts. And when I send out partial manuscripts, that process can be a lot longer. And like Elizabeth was saying, we have books too that have been kicking around for 20 years. We try to cut a lot of those books off, and we don't encourage them. Right? We don't at all. But we just had a book come out called Out in the Union that was under contract for I think almost 20 years. That's about gays and lesbians and unions and the history of that, and it's done really well for us. So I'm glad that we kept her for that long.
I hate to say it all depends, but it all depends. The peer review process, which is a big milestone, we typically ask reviewers to turn around their comments in 4 to 6 weeks. That happens about a third of the time. So that process tends to drag. Once the manuscript is revised and in-house, it really depends on the length, the complexity, what kind of a book it is, and the market. So for monographs that are all text, for instance, we would typically turn those out in about 8 months or so. And we're not competing here. I mean, these are different kinds of timelines.
Yeah. It's going to keep getting lower.
If it's right, Peter's going to do it in 2 months. But if it's an anthology, you've got 12, 15 contributors, and it tends to be a little slower process, so we allow for maybe 10 months, maybe a little longer if it's really complex. We do, at Georgetown, a lot of language instruction resources in less commonly taught languages like Arabic. That's a couple of years. I mean, because there's a lot of audiovisual stuff, a lot of color and so forth, so that's a completely different kind of consideration. But it really does depend on the kind of book and the kind of market. I just want to add one thing. In terms of the trade books, Carol's mentioned trade books, and Peter will speak to that later, but you know, it's interesting how your impulse is, well, let's get it out into the market as soon as possible. And in fact, our sales reps tell us, no, 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 wait until the middle end of the publishing season so the marketing team can really get out there and make a lot of noise about it. You know, you don't want it coming right out of the gate in January for a spring season. So there are lots of considerations on that end too, that you know, it actually may slow down a little bit rather than race to market, depending on the audience.
Not to sort of pull rank on my colleagues here, but I had a proposal, a book delivered to me when I was at Oxford in 1998 that had been put under contract in 1963. I actually got a call. I was sitting at my desk. I just recently started work at OUP, and I got a phone call from a person who sounded rather elderly. He said, "This is Professor so-and-so," and I just thought, I've been working on a book that's been under contract to you since 1963. I didn't even, I mean, I actually had a piece of paper to file that confirmed that this was true. Yeah. And he said, I just wanted to let you know that I'm almost done. His book was a study of, he said, the good news is I'm almost done with the manuscript. The bad news is this is only going to be volume 1. The book was a study of the political thought of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and in relation to the political thought of the Founding Fathers. And he sent in the manuscript, which was itself, volume 1 of his manuscript was in fact in 2 volumes, 2 comb-bound stacks of manuscript. And it took Abraham Lincoln's life up to sort of the middle of 1862, which some of you may recall was about a year before the Gettysburg Address was delivered. So his book on the Gettysburg Address didn't actually have the Gettysburg Address. I figured that the worst that could happen if I can get a really good article in Publishers Weekly about this if we publish it, but in fact it didn't work. It was in fact later published by somebody else. So there was hope for every project. But I mean, at Oxford we often had people deliver. I mean, I inherited sort of a list of books in history in particular from my predecessor, was a guy named Sheldon Meyer, who was at Oxford for 40 years and personally sort of racked up about 19 Pulitzer Prizes as an editor there. He had an incredible stable of authors, and many books that Sheldon had signed up in the 1980s were still coming in the 1990s and the aughts. And so, in fact, a book that, I mean, Oxford, I think a year or 2 ago, published a sort of magisterial history by Gordon Wood of the Revolution, which is not in the contract since before I got to Oxford in the 1990s. So, you know, the projects do have a long gestation sometimes. In trade, the publishing, there are actually you identify those kind of competing impulses of let's get this thing out there as quickly. And once the book is ready and edited and it's gone through the development and the copy editing and so forth, let's get it out there as quickly as possible. But you also have the sort of fact that the metabolism of the publishing business doesn't tend to respond well to instant publishing. The bookstores and media and sort of subsidiary rights outlets and all these kinds of things tend to need a long lead time. You want to really sort of be able to lay the groundwork and sort of prepare the marketing for anything that you're trying to make a real splash with. There are exceptions when there's something super topical, and something like the Star report I remember was put out over a weekend by publishers, and and some publishers are very adept at doing those kind of instant publications. I remember, I mean, the book, one of the most sort of prominent books of this past year, Tommy Coates' book, Between the World and Me, was pushed up by several months from its original planned publication Ferguson and Baltimore and all those kinds of things. They really felt there was a need in the marketplace for an appetite for a book that was going to address issues of race and justice and all those kinds of things. That proved to be a pretty successful decision on the publisher's part, but I mean, he was already a prominent figure and a prominent commentator on these topics, so they weren't trying to really start the momentum from zero. I've been involved in books where we crash them, we use the term that we use in publishing, we rush something out as quickly as possible. But it tends to be, and I have this conversation with authors all the time, because they want to get the book, of course, out into people's hands as quickly as possible once they've spent how many years writing it. But laying the groundwork for things and letting buzz develop, whether it's in a scholarly field or the media at large or social media or whatever, is something where you tend to want to have that time to develop things.
Okay, more questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Leonard Schmieding. I'm a visiting researcher at the BMW Center for German European Studies here. I'm German. I got my PhD in Germany and at the University of Leipzig in history with a thesis on hip-hop culture in East Germany during the Cold War. And so when the wall was still up. And the book has been published in German, and now I'm looking to publishers to publish it in English, and I had a nice talk with Sara this morning about that. But I'm also wondering, and I really like what you said, there's about the book being, or you producing the book in its best version, right? So, and I think that all presses do that, all publishers want to have that. My question is, in which discipline, right? I mean, I'm a historian, but the book is also recognized as a contribution to American studies, which is more interdisciplinary. And then I'm using theory and contributions from history, from American studies, from both German scholars, like who publish in German, and then English scholars, or American scholars who publish in English. So how are you going to make this work, or how do presses or publishers make this work in the peer review process? How do you identify the main arguments? Who do you address in order to, as peer reviewers? American scholars who also know German, know the German literature, or work with translations, and so on and so forth. So that would be a question that interests me.
So should we go down the line again? So I mean, I think Carol sort of started off talking about fit. So I think that's a super important question to consider because your book is going to fit very differently on a different publisher's list. So depending on what it's next to in the catalog, that's going to, sort of determine who sees it, how it's taken up, and what that context is. In the specific case of the book you talked about, where the book is available in German, I don't think that German scholars are going to be an important audience for the book because those people will read it in German.
Yeah.
So the challenge for you is to figure out then how to position it to American studies scholars and to make it relevant to people who care about hip hop or who care about totalitarianism or whatever the sort of the theoretical apparatus that you're applying to the book is. As an editor, when we see projects like that are intersectional, across fields, interdisciplinary in that way, often what we'll do is actually something like we'll make 2 lists of potential peer reviewers. So we'll have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we'll try to get one from one list and one from the other list to make sure that we have as many potential audiences for the book covered as possible. Is that helpful?
Yeah, so both for German history as a discipline in American academia and American studies as a discipline in American academia.
Possibly. I mean, German history isn't a big field for Duke, so that's probably, for us, that's not what we would see. If you brought the book to us, it would be very different than if you brought it to a press that had a stronger German history list.
Right.
So that's some of the big questions.
Right. Okay.
I think what's interesting about your book is that you already have the reviews from the German reviewers. And so one of the things that we talked about this morning is I think that we would, or any other of us would probably want to see those reviews so that we know about that audience and those scholars and how they were thinking of it. But I'm inclined to agree with Elizabeth that, people who are German scholars are going to read it in German. And so for an American audience, you want to think about who you're addressing with it. And I think on our list, I think, because we don't have a list in German history, the thing I'd want to see you thinking about is hip hop, which we published on, social movements maybe, political history and theory, and to the extent that that's applicable. So kind of thinking about where American scholars, what fields of American scholars might be interested in looking at the book from. I think that with too heavy of an emphasis on German thinkers and on German history, it might not fit as well. But at the same time, I understand that that's obviously a component of the book. And probably one of the selling points too, right? I mean, if an American scholar were looking at this, they might not know the German literature as in days too.
So I have a publishing question. You published this in Germany, and who was the publisher?
Franz Steiner Verlag in Stuttgart.
And are they interested in having a translation done? I mean, have you pushed them to find an English translator?
You could do that, or I could do that, yes. I have not pushed them. I have retained the English language, the world English language rights.
You have, okay.
If I gave my rights to them, they could look for someone to translate it and pay for it, but then they would sell it to an American or to an English language publisher, and I don't know whether that's common practice or not. So I have not heard any opinion on that, whether people actually do that or whether that's more an obstacle than an asset.
Well, I mean, my impulse would be you should talk to the publisher about the prospects they have for doing an English translation, whether here in the US or in the UK. I think in some ways that would simplify matters a lot. I mean, all of us here, all publishers, we go to Frankfurt Book Fair every October. We talk to dozens and dozens of other editors or rights people about translations. And I honestly think, I mean, from the brief description you gave, I think it's going to be really hard to find a publisher who's going to be interested in doing that book. I mean, I hate to be blunt about it, but I just want to be honest. You could find some presses that have lists that you could have conversations, but the fact that it's been published in German with a German audience, I think your best option is to try to seek a translation.
Well, if I could piggyback on what Richard just said, I used to handle rights and translations for Jumble. And one of the options you might have is to negotiate with the press so that they would have the rights for a limited time. So you could say, and I've done this with our authors before, so you could say, you guys can have the rights for 4 years, and if you sell it, great. If you don't, then I want it back and I want to work on a translation myself. So that might be something you would want to consider as well.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that's one of our key negotiation things. Often we don't have a lot of negotiation power. Depends on, these are sometimes smaller books and it's just really hard to have a lot of muscle. But you can at least bargain for time. You can at least say, oh, that's fine. You want to hold my feet to the fire on that? Okay, but by X date. And then, like you say, if these books have a long life, it would still be relevant when the time runs out. I've never seen a publisher refuse to put a date on that, because it's only fair.
John Warren, the head of George Mason University Press. I was wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about how digital opportunities are changing things at the press. Like, how is it changing your acquisitions process, and how is it changing the way that you present books? Like, are you doing websites that complement the books? Are you thinking about apps? What kind of things are you doing? I happen to know a little bit about Georgetown's thing and that, but otherwise.
Thank you for the question. I'll look forward to hearing your answer as well. I have been surprised, quite honestly, by how little digital factors into some of our decision-making process. I think in acquisitions, in production, and in marketing, it's been a much bigger change in terms of thinking about digital marketing, in terms of producing ebooks. So we now publish all of our titles, or most of them, simultaneously in cloth, paper, and electronic versions. So trying to get the e-version out simultaneously has been a challenge that we're really happy to have met. If an author comes to us, having taken the Scalar bootcamp, so do folks know about Scalar? It's this platform out of USC where they match authors, academics, and web designers and produce open access book projects that are really beautiful. So for example, our author Nick Salmond has a scalar site for his book, The Birth of an Industry, that's about minstrelsy and early animation. Our author Nicole Starosielski has a beautiful scalar site for her book, The Undersea Network. In both of those cases, those authors had been part of a scalar boot camp and had learned the process and had been matched. They came to us with the website, so we were able, with our production team, to sort of work out ways to link the ebook to the website. Obviously in the print book, there's sort of a note that says for this digital experience. We've tried some things with making ebooks in color that look really just gorgeous on an iPad. But in general, we found that there just hasn't been enough uptake of individual single title ebook sales to make investing a lot of work in them worthwhile. I think we're still seeing most of the people that want to buy a Duke Press book want to buy a paper book, whether for purposes of teaching, right? So, turn to page 54, can't do that in an ebook, or for purposes of annotation. I think the annotation tools in e-readers are coming a long way, but I don't think they're quite there yet for most scholars, is my understanding, for really serious research. So, and in terms of acquisition, I think we know that our production department is doing as much as they can to produce the 120 books a year that we publish. So we just don't have the resources that we would like to be able to sort of innovate in that area. So it is a challenge, but because we haven't seen it significantly affect the uptake of the books we are producing, I think it's something that we're always sort of have in the back of our mind, but it rarely makes it to the front, unfortunately.
Bill?
I'm Bill McDonald, Sociology Department here at Georgetown University, and I'm working on a book about immigration and crime, including illegal immigrants coming across borders and doing bad things. I want to get it crashed out while the presidential campaign is still going on. It will help sales. No, that's good. But I was very interested in what you were saying, Elizabeth, about asking the big question and taking a look at what you're working with and, in a sense, flipping it and getting to the big question. I'm just wondering if the other presses have the same kind of expectation from manuscripts. And could you give me an example of that?
I could let other people answer the first question first. Duke is the only press I've worked at, so it's the only one that I know, so.
I can say that we absolutely use the same criteria. I mean, there's no proposal that comes to me or any of my colleagues that we don't say, so what, right? And especially with folks who haven't written books before, I always have to go back to them and say, rewrite your proposal and show me what the stakes of this project are, right? Is it a project about Korean cinema or is it a project about something else? And it's almost never about Korean cinema, right? That's the archive they're working with and the arguments. So that's, I think, a really important question to think about in any publication process.
At Georgetown, the publishing committee sits around a table and makes decisions, thumbs up or thumbs down on projects. And the most important question, the most important non-financial question is, what is the contribution? That's the term we use. So Elizabeth has used the term questions. Big question. We use the term contribution, and when we send manuscripts out to readers to review those manuscripts, that's the fundamental question among a list of 8 different questions we ask that they follow and respond to in doing their reviews. What is the contribution to this of this book to the particular field? And we really hang our hats editorially on those contributions. Now, there's a whole other set of questions about financial issues. We actually use the term contribution. It's a financial, but that's a different contribution. This is the intellectual contribution to the field. So that really, if you boil it all down, that's what we're looking for.
When I worked at Oxford in particular, which was where my job was to publish books that were going to be of interest to the general audience, when they were coming out of rigorous scholarship and not all my authors were academics. Some of them were journalists or independent scholars or whatever, but I had to sort of meet the criteria of both on the kind of scholarly side, where everything I published was peer-reviewed and deemed to be worthy of the Oxford imprimatur, and I had to sort of think back to who's the audience for this out there, who's going to go into Barnes & Noble or find this in their independent bookstore or Amazon or what have you. And that was really, for on both sides of, of that sort of line, the question of who's going to care is still what you're asking as an editor. What's this going to say? What does this say that's going to be relevant and exciting to people in discipline that this author is working in? And how do I get my mother-in-law, who goes to the library every week or goes to the local bookstore, interested in this, or somebody, not my mother-in-law, somebody who I know is interested in American history or sociology or policy, what have you. And so you're almost asking that question, I think, as an editor, is what is it that's going to catch somebody's imagination? What's going to, how do I, when I finished reading the definition of proposal and manuscript, it was, first of all, did I get to the end? Was my interest held all the way through this? And then, do I want to go out and tell somebody else about this? Once I finish this, do I have that impulse? Like, I can't wait to tell you about this interesting thing I just read. Or wasn't this, and it might be in a relatively narrow area, or it might be about the history of World War II. But as long as it's got that sort of spark in the material, that motivates you as an acquiring editor.
And you're waiting patiently to ask a question.
No, thank you.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, Pat Eddington, professor here in the Security Studies program at Georgetown. Thanks to all of you for carving out time, and those of you who traveled, very special thanks. In my day job at the Cato Institute, I am working constantly at the nexus of national security and civil liberties, which has been a pretty hot topic over the course of the last couple of years. And I had a previous publishing experience with the University Press, none of yours, so that's good. But I ran into this situation where they required unanimous approval, essentially, and I had 2 reviewers who loved what I put together, and a third who was what I'll refer to as a ringer. This is someone who actually worked in the intelligence community. I'm 99% sure I know who it was, but I never called the acquisitions editor on it. But because they had that criteria of unanimity among the peer reviewers, it killed the project with that particular press. And I ultimately got the book published elsewhere. But so I'm really curious, do you all have to have unanimity from your peer reviewers as a general rule? Or do you take into account the fact that if you are dealing with a very contentious subject, a controversial subject, that unanimity is not necessarily a great criteria? Certainly majority or supermajority maybe, but anyway, kind of a long-winded question there.
As an acquisitions editor, I would sort of be horrified. I think to get a review like that, I think it's so rare because we really do try to send books to people that we think, even if they maybe disagree with the conclusion, will be on board with the conceptualization of the project. We would, if we had 2 very mixed reviews like that, send it to an adjudicating reader, and usually that would be if the adjudicating reader said, this is an interesting project, an important project, it makes an important contribution, it deserves to be published. That would be sufficient for us, assuming that the author was willing to at least consider that potential misreading as something that could be out there, that could stay with the book, and sort of think about maybe potential ways to address it. Of course, with contentious topics like that, you may well not be able to address that person's concerns, but at least to know that they exist is also important, I think.
And we also really look at the big picture. I've definitely gotten what I would call unfair reviews from people, and usually when I get those, a lot of times you send a review to an author and they say, this person doesn't understand my book, but that's not really true. The person does understand the book and the author's feelings are hurt. When there are cases where that happens, and I agree with the author, then I often bring in another reader. And, you know, I have to, before I can offer somebody a contract, I have to take all my projects before a faculty editorial board for approval. And so what I've presented projects to them with mixed reviews, where there's somebody who says absolutely not, somebody who says absolutely yes. And then I just have to do a harder sell, and sometimes I can get them through. But I mean, the short answer to the question is, we don't require unanimity. We try to look at everything together.
Similarly, we send everything out to 2 readers. Sometimes for revised dissertations, we'll send it out to 3 readers, but typically 2. And if we have a sort of a mixed verdict, we'll send it to a 3rd person. So, and then we always ask the author to send us a memo. We call it a revision memo. Respond to the reviews. Tell us what you think you want to revise and what you think is not something you want to revise and why. So that's the sort of, we take that into account. We do not need unanimity.
I would just add that my feeling as an editor was I would rather, it was the same thing at Oxford, we did not require unanimous reviews. And I mean, sometimes we published projects that had very decisively split responses from readers. My feeling as a publisher was always, I would rather publish a book that gets passionate responses from people, positive or negative, as long as some of them are positive, then books.
I always thought pushback was a good
Then
thing.
books then a book that gets sort of lukewarm responses from every reader.
Yeah.
You'd rather publish a book that is controversial and says something in a controversy than something that's a middle of the road book that's not going to excite people on either side of a question.
Thank you.
Dick.
Hi, I'm Richard American in the School of Business, but I'm not a career academic. I was fed for 20 years before. So I don't have a PhD, academic credentials. I'm doing a book that I call Solving the Race Problem.
Is an MBA.
It's a prescriptive book. It's policy and strategy. The question is, it's a trade book. And trade publishers talk about platform. Do you have a platform? And you alluded to it when you talked about the Coates book, that he's got notoriety, I would call it. But what weight do you give to that? In other words, are you known? Are you a household name? Will your name sell the book? Those kinds of marketing questions. How do you factor those in?
Well, I would say it's hugely important to a publisher, and particularly, I mean, I think it's important in scholarly, even in a monograph, right? The more stature you have in your field, the better your book is likely to sell. But certainly for looking for books that sell to a general audience, the more prominent the author is, the better. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't, that you have to have 1 million Twitter followers or a talk show, a reality show to be a successful author. But
It's getting to that.
I mean, publishers do look at that, and they increasingly now, especially in the larger, more commercial houses, the question, I mean, because they're trying to sell books at very high levels of sales, and it's like, can we get this author in the Today Show? Does this person have that 1 million Twitter followers? I think you can start, what's to me more important thing about publishing a trade book is do you have, if not a huge platform, do you have a toehold? Do you have a way of starting a conversation about your book among some audience of people? And do you have a way of reaching those people and getting them interested and excited about what you have to say? It can be within an academic arena, it can be within a business, milieu. But you do have to, it really does, the bigger your platform is, the better, there's no doubt about it.
And I think willingness to sell the book, even if your name alone will sell it, for us, our trade list is obviously much smaller. Not people that are household names, but people that are willing to really get out there and buy several copies of their book to bring to events. They're willing to talk to their book about every person they, talk about their book to every person they meet. They're willing to add it to their email signature, to really work the room at every conference they go to really self-promote, to promote on Twitter, on Facebook, on all of these different platforms. I think that's become really important, even for our non-trade list, that's how people hear about books as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking, when you say platform, we use platform also when we're talking about academic books, and it's more like what Liz is talking about, right? So somebody, like I have the author who I was talking about before with this ghost ethnography book, and his platform is that, like, right now, he's the president of the Society for Symbolic Interaction. And that's actually a great way for him to be getting out and getting attention for the book. Sometimes we'll have authors who are very active bloggers, and that is a sign to us that there are people who are going to be willing to promote their book, and people who have an audience already built in. So when we're talking, we want to see people with platforms too, for those of you who are scholars. But we don't expect you to have, a million Twitter followers on it, right?
Hey, Richard, we've met before. Have you talked to Beacon?
Not lately. Not within the last 2 or 3 years.
Okay, all right. Maybe we can have a conversation later.
Great.
Also, a quick thing about numbers, because I want to ask our panel for you to keep calibrating my numbers. I tell my authors that one of the key reasons that it's great to go to the trade side of a university house rather than thinking that you need to jump over to a commercial publisher like Knopf or Norton or something like that, is that you can sell about half as many books and still be a really successful title at the trade list of a university press. And the numbers I've always been giving them are you can sell between maybe 7,000 and 10,000 books at a university press, and you would have to sell over twice that many at a trade press to be considered a success. Are my numbers correct? What would you say for the trade side of the house on a university press? Can you go 7 to 10 and be successful, or could you do even fewer? What would you need to make a trade, to crack the nut for trade? And is 20 right for commercial?
We would be thrilled to have a book that sold 7,000 to 10,000
Yeah.
copies.
Yeah. Do you have a purely trade list though?
No, we always have a small trade,
Right,
so we have
right.
several trade titles on any given list, but it's
Yeah,
it's
but you
small.
don't like have a trade division, I'm
No,
thinking,
we
because, yeah, but that's good to know.
We don't have a trade division either, but we do, when we do a big trade book, a big trade book, like we did Philadelphia Eagles Encyclopedia, or I brought for Carol, The
Oh yeah,
Audacity of
I'll show you guys this.
Basketball at the Age of Obama. I mean, for those kinds of books, we're looking for around 10,000 in sales. But for our other trade books, we don't need nearly that many for it to
Show
be
it off.
successful.
And what were the numbers? Because I actually got my big thing from Tim Bennett at Oxford said 7 to 10 would be okay for Oxford trade. Would you agree with that number, or would
I
you
would
say
have
we need
said,
to be
I would have
more?
said, I mean, again, how you define success is
Yeah,
varies from project to project. Sometimes your expectations for some things were more
Yeah.
modest. I mean, I published books at OUP that sold 5,000 copies that I was happy with.
on the trade side.
Yeah, but I mean,
Okay.
7 to 10 would be,
That's good to know.
quite a
Yeah.
healthy number for them. I mean, nowadays, again, I think a place like Norton would certainly want to sell 15 or 20,000 copies, something if they could. But again, they probably publish good books that sell 10,000, and they're happy with those if they got them. Also, the other thing is, and this is really important, when I started working at Oxford, I come from working at Random House, and I had lunch with a very sort of distinguished elder literary agent named Jerry McCauley, who represented all kinds of prominent historians. And I said, you sell books to Norton and Knopf and FSG and Random House, and what sort of, I can't usually pay the kind of advances that those publishers are paying, so are you ever going to send me anything? And he said, I've been selling books at Oxford for 20 years, and for 30 years or something like that, and some of the first books I sold, I'm still getting royalty checks for. Those books are on the backlist, they keep selling. And so, a book that sells 5,000 copies in its first year might go on to sell for 20 or 30 years if it's a really enduring contribution to its field. So you don't look at success in that short-term a way sometimes. And I've, books that I thought that weren't any great shakes when I published them the first season that they came out are still chugging along the backlist of Oxford now 10 or 15 years later. So I think, I never got sort of completely hung up on the idea of what the first year number was going to be.
And
Yeah,
Richard, I jumped right over you, sorry about that.
No, that's okay, that's okay. Peter has a lot more to say about this. But I would just add, I'm a little skeptical of sort of blanket statements about what's success. Like Peter suggested, I think as a publisher, one thing you absolutely have to do in trade publishing is to cover your advance. I mean, you want to make sure you sell enough copies to recover the advance you put out. So if you're putting out a $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 advance, I mean, you do then need to start selling 10,000, 15,000 copies and more. But if you're going to spend, you know, $5,000 for an advance, which is kind of our world, you don't need to sell 10,000, 20,000 copies to recover that advance. So that's another way to think about success.
Right, that's the other contribution that you talked about.Hat's the contribution? And we did this every time we acquired a book. We ran a projected set of numbers, how much could it sell, what's going to cost us to do that, what's the net figure at the bottom of this. That's the contribution that this book makes to our expenses. And if that's a positive number, the book's a success at some level.
Yeah, very good. Last question. Let's see. We will go to torn between Ella and Carrie. Actually, if they're quick, we might be able to do both. Why don't we start with Ella, and then if we have time, we'll go to Carrie.
My name's Ella. I'm in the government department. I'm working on a book about why it's so hard for minorities and the poor to get a voice in politics. And I'm arguing that's actually caused by a fundamental representational equality, causes inequality, paradox there. My question is, just coming new into this process, what kinds of things do you look for a proposal? I mean, you've been talking about fit and you've been talking about big question. Are there other things that you look for in a proposal for a book, or other things that are kind of red flags, things that you should absolutely not do, that, I mean, there's going to be variation there based on ideas and stuff, but are there any kind of general ideas?
I'm glad you asked this question because I had meant to say a little bit more about proposals and then didn't. One thing we find particularly for first books is that, I mean, at Duke, we tend to work much more through relationships and networks and talking to people about their book before we ever get a proposal. So in general, my advice is that your time is better spent working on your book and going to meetings and talking to people that come to town, or when you travel, you know, for conferences, making sure that you're setting up meetings with editors in the field. Talking to your advisors and your mentors about who they've published with, talking to Carol, of course, and really getting a sense of the fit, trying to build interest in your project before you ever write a proposal. I think for many of the projects that I work on, both for my own list and for Ken's list, we never see a proposal. We've gone from, I've talked to this person about their project, I've met with them several times, I've read maybe a draft of their introduction, I think this is important work, I know that they can write, I know that their ideas are important in the field, I'm ready to send this out. So I think there's a lot of anxiety, especially for first-time authors, about the proposal, and I want to suggest that that anxiety is better channeled into actually writing your book. I think the proposal is very important, and particularly for like a second book, we'll often send out a proposal in a couple of sample chapters, but if we like a proposal, we will ask for the full manuscript. And so then the question is sort of like, what is the proposal really doing? And I think at Duke, I would say that for first books in particular, we accept very, very few books that we get as proposals.
And that, you know, it's funny, this is why I ask often editors to speak for themselves. It's actually the first time I've heard that.
Yeah,
I'm
sorry.
Yeah,
And I think that is
valuable,
unique
right?
to us.
You got to
I think that's,
yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, you've met one editor, you've met one editor, yeah.
I think what you have going for you in working with Ken is that he is a brand, right? And he has a huge network that generates projects. For somebody like me who's just getting started out at a press where almost all of our senior editors left within a year, so we're all kind of working to rebuild a list, we have a very different way of working. So, I mean, yes, I do get references from people in my network, but because my network is probably like a 16th, if that, the size of Ken's, that wouldn't be enough for me to have a list. So for me, the proposal is important. What I've been doing lately, I'll be reading journal articles or I'll look at conference programs and I'll reach out to people and say, I love the way that your project sounds, or I love your writing, send me a proposal. And so the proposal is really important to me. And I was actually just interviewed about this, so if you give me your business card, I can send you a link to the interview that I did, where I talked about some of the things that I think you should remember if you're submitting a proposal.
Actually,
to a
if you
press
send me
like
that
mine.
link too,
Sure.
I'd like to share that around.
Absolutely.
It's always good, I'll blog about it or something.
Cool. Yeah.
That'll help us. I'd love, unless you have more thoughts about this, I'd love to also squeeze in Carrie's question, just because I love her.
Carrie Danner, Department of Theology, and it's a related question. So my question was, how often in your experience do you extend a contract only after reading a chapter or two for a first-time book?
Oh, good, those two fit together, yeah. And also for your answers, feel free to go back to the previous one if you have something relevant to say. I just want to make sure we hear this.
I've been doing that a lot, actually. When I was at UNC Press as an editorial assistant, we almost never did it, especially for our first book, because the argument was, we want to see the whole book before we commit to it. My thinking lately is that I would almost rather get involved with the book earlier, because sometimes by the time you've drafted the whole manuscript, the damage is done, and you're going to be in kind of a mess. So especially because I'm still list building and I have a little bit more time than some editors do, some other editors do. I've been sending a lot of 2 chapters of proposals out for review, and then if the process goes positively, I'll offer an advance contract, and it allows me to get involved early, it allows the press to get involved early, it allows you to get reader feedback early. I think that there's nothing bad about it. When I'm more senior, I might change my tune, but right now, I've been doing that a fair amount, and my colleagues do it also.
Is it a contingent contract, like contingent on it passing peer review later, the whole book?
Our advance contract and our full contract are identical except for, I think, 5 or 6 words. And the 5 or 6 words difference is, that basically we will not publish your book unless it successfully makes it through one more round of peer review.
John is making a reference to a contract that we have at the press. John and I used to be colleagues at Georgetown. So we have that contingent contract as well, we call it, which is very similar to what Sara just mentioned. We have changed over the years. I mean, when I first got to Georgetown, we would never offer a contract based on a proposal and a chapter or 2 if it was a first book. We just simply would not do it. We don't do it very often, but the door is slightly open now. And we would like to see at least evidence of really good, rigorous scholarship in the form of essays, articles, something that shows us that you've really got what it takes to carry a long argument. So I think it's possible, but we would always, as John suggested, have a contingent contract on that. It's a valid contract, but there is a clause that says it has to pass peer review when the full manuscript is submitted. And we have never reneged on that. I mean, it's a protection that we've never had to invoke, really. And we've always published the books that have emerged from a contingent contract.
And John sent out partial manuscripts for first books, and we don't issue advance contracts, so.
Can I just say one quick
Yes,
thing about
absolutely. Last
proposals? Which is, I kind of agree with you that I often found it really helpful to get involved in the process at the stage of conceptualizing it, which is the proposal stage. And I also agree there's a lot of anxiety about proposals, but I would urge everybody to think of a proposal as this is a way of sort of creating a blueprint of what you're writing and having to back and forth at that stage with an editor about how to shape it and what's the most effective way to make your argument or tell your story can be beneficial. So you should, in the same way that I think you should look at peer review as a positive, helpful thing in developing your work. I think I always found that getting to a really solid proposal and getting a really good outline for something was a huge step forward in getting to a successful manuscript.
And when it can be that kind of productive work, I think that's
Right.
absolutely really important. I don't mean to say that the proposals aren't important, and you should read Bill Germano's book about academic publishing to read really good advice on writing a good proposal. And with that, Elizabeth Ault and Sara Cohen, Richard Brown, Peter Ginna, you have been wonderful correspondents. Thank you very much. more events like this forever and ever and ever.
Okay.